Hey there, I ended with Nehemiah chapter 3. I took you through 1 through 3 very hurriedly, I think about in 18 minutes, as I skipped through different verses, trying to point out some things that I found so interesting in the book of Nehemiah. And I'm going to take this time to kind of hurriedly get through 4, 5, and 6 of Nehemiah. And we are looking at the work carried on in chapter 4. And we are going to start with verse 1 in chapter 4 that says, "Now it came about that when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became furious and very angry, and he mocked the Jews." Now, again, I'd like to recommend that you take and put a square around the wall every time you see that phrase, the wall, because as I stated in the first video of chapters 1 through 3, we are looking into how the wall is being rebuilt and who's doing what and who the enemies are, and the opposition that is coming against Nehemiah and all those that are working to repair the walls. But now, just to give you just a brief history on Sanballat, he is a Moabite, and he is an opponent of Nehemiah. And he's first mentioned in chapter 2, verses 10 and verses 19. And here we find that he's furious. He's very angry, and he mocked the Jews. And we'll see in verse 7 that he hears that the repairs of the walls of Jerusalem went on. Despite his fury, his anger, it just didn't matter. That was not what they were focused on. And that's just to let us know that we can always be certain that we will face opposition in doing the work of the Lord. But if you will go down to, if you have your Bibles, and we are in Nehemiah chapter 4, we find that Nehemiah is praying. Not only does he pray, but he prepares. Sometimes along the way, along the journey of something that God has placed on our heart to do, we are going to have to stop and pray during those times that we face opposition, because that's where we draw our strength, and that's where we get our wisdom and the courage that we need to carry on with that which he has laid upon our hearts. Nehemiah says, "But we prayed," I'm looking at verse 9, "but we prayed to our God, and because of them," our enemies, "we set up a guard against them day and night." So not only did he pray, he also prepared. And that's a great reminder, a great example to us. He stationed men, in verse 13, in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, the bare or the exposed places, and he stationed the people in families with their swords, spears, and bows. And he says in verse 14, "When I saw their fear," Nehemiah is recognizing the fear of the people who were working on the wall. "When I saw their fear, I rose up and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people." And here's what he commanded: "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses." See, opposition should never be a reason to quit. In fact, it should be the reason that we continue in the work of the Lord. And be on guard. Do not be afraid. And carry on. So Nehemiah is recognizing their fear, but he's also reminding them of the Lord. And in verse 15, we find that they return to the work, and they carried on, and they stood guard. Verse 15 says, "When our enemies heard that it was known to us, and that God had frustrated their plan," talking about the enemies, "then all of us returned to the wall, each one to his work." Now, I want you to pay attention to the tenacity that we will find in verses 16 through 18. "From that day on, half of my servants carried on the work, while half of them held the spears, the shields, the bows, and the breastplates, and the captains were behind the whole house of Judah. Those who were rebuilding the wall and those who carried burdens took their load with one hand doing the work, and the other holding a weapon. Verse 18, as for the builders, each wore his sword girded at his side as he built, while the trumpeter stood near me. And then later on, we see in verse 21 that says, so we carried on the work with half of them holding the spears from dawn until the stars appeared. Now that is some determination. And in verse 20, if you would just want to back up there, it says, at whatever place you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there, or assemble yourselves there. Our God will fight for us. Now that is faith talking. And then they're putting that faith into determination when he says, so we carried on the work with half of them holding the spears from the dawn until the stars appeared. And it just now occurred to me that as you've heard the word spear several times, I revert back to Jim Elliot's friend, Ed McCauley, who I shared with you in the first part of Nehemiah and how I came to study this particular book in the Bible, who was actually, both were speared to death by the Alka Indians. And so I just find that so interesting that when he wrote that, when Ed McCauley wrote those quotes that I shared with you to Jim Elliot, little did he know that that would be the exact way that he died and gave his life on behalf of Christ and wanting to tell people who did not know of Jesus Christ the very story, the very gospel of why Jesus came and that he died for them. But in chapter 5, we find that Nehemiah is now appointed governor. So remember, he was a cupbearer in chapter 1, and now we find that he was appointed the governor. And the first 5 verses, and I'm not going to read them in chapter 5, we're going to hear a lot of complaining. And there's an outcry going on, and Nehemiah is going to address this. He becomes angry when he was hearing the outcry of the words of the people. And a thought came to my mind that I wrote down beside the first 5 verses of chapter 5. And it says, when we look at our circumstances, we've taken our gaze off of the one who can change them, who can change our very circumstances that we're actually sitting around complaining about. But we find over here what Nehemiah says to them in verse 8. He says, I said to them, we, according to our ability, have redeemed, or we have bought our Jewish brothers who were sold to the nations. Now would you even sell your brothers that they would be sold to us? Then they were silent. Those complainers were silent, and they could not find a word to say. So this is a reality check. And then we find that Nehemiah in verse 11 is giving them some advice. We find in verse 12 that advice is taken. We find that in verse 13 that advice is carried out. We find a great example. What a great leader, a great example of Nehemiah being the leader that he was. Because in verse 15 he says, the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants domineered the people. But I did not do so, because the fear of God. What great leadership, just that respect and that fear of God. And I love that he was a great example as a leader. He was not a dictator. He was a hands-on kind of leader. And I think we need a lot more of that today. We find in verse 19, I'm still in chapter 5, and this is the last verse in chapter 5. We find that Nehemiah is praying, and he says, remember me, oh my God, for good according to all that I have done for this people. Now we look at chapter 6 briefly, and we find here that the wall is completed with the help of God. And if you will go through, like I recommended, and still be marking those words, the wall with a square around it, we find that in chapter 6 verse 2 that then Sanballat, he's just everywhere up in our business here, sent a message to Nehemiah, and actually there was a total of 5 letters, but the last one that was brought to Nehemiah, here's what was written in this letter in verse 6. It is reported among the nations and Gashmu says that you and the Jews are planning to rebel. Therefore, you are rebuilding the wall, and you are to be their king according to these reports. You have also appointed prophets to proclaim in Jerusalem concerning you a king is in Judah. And now it will be reported to the king according to these reports. So come now, let us take counsel together. So then Nehemiah sends a message in verse 8. Then I sent a message to him saying, such things as you are saying have not been done, but you are inventing them in your own mind or with your own heart. See, they were trying to frighten Nehemiah, thinking that they would become so discouraged, as says in verse 9, with the work that it would not be done. And now we see that Nehemiah is pressing on, and he's praying for strength despite what's being said or what's being told. He says, but now, oh God, strengthen my hands. He's not given up, and he is depending upon God, which is what a great example of what we should also do. And so then we find in verse 10, there's a little bit of trickery going on by the enemies. And so we have to beware. And verse 12, Nehemiah says, then I perceived, or then I had this discernment that surely God had not sent this individual who had tried to trick him. And he realizes that he was hired for a reason to frighten Nehemiah and those that were building the wall. He says he was hired for this reason, that I might become frightened and act accordingly and sin, so that they, the enemies, might have an evil report, in order that they would reproach me, or that they would defy me, or taunt me, or jeopardize me. And then we find Nehemiah praying again in verse 14, chapter 6. Remember, O my God, Tobiah and Sanballat, according to these works of theirs, and the prophetess and the rest of the prophets who were trying to frighten me. Now he is praying over his enemies. So the wall, we find in chapter 6, verse 15. So the wall was completed on the 25th of the month Elul. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but it is spelled E-L-U-L, in 52 days. And this particular month is the 6th Jewish month, corresponding to August or September. Now we found in chapter 1 was the month of Chislev, meaning his confidence is when Nehemiah's brother and the men from Judah came, and that's the actual 9th Hebrew month of the calendar, corresponding to November and December. And then we find in chapter 2 the month of Nisan, which means their flight. It is the first month of the Jewish calendar, corresponding to March or April, and this is actually when the king asks Nehemiah, what's going on? What would you request? He could tell that he had this sickness, this sadness of heart that we read about in chapter 2. So now we find that we're in the 6th month of the corresponding to August or September, when the wall was completed. And you're going to see where you've marked the wall, you're getting ready to see all about the people, starting in chapter 7. So verse 16 says, when all our enemies heard of it, that the wall had been completed, and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. The tables were so turned. Who's scared now is what I thought. And with the help of God, the work He places on our hearts to do will be accomplished. We have just got to pray through that opposition. And so stand firm and stay true to God and trust Him always. We will look at chapters 7, 8, and 9 a little bit later. Gotta go. Bye.